When was the last time that you sat around with a group of fellow yoga teachers and had an honest conversation about what you're actually practicing at home and what you're actually teaching in your classes? Maybe never, because honestly, groups of yoga teachers don't always feel all that open. Often they feel very judgmental, and people wouldn't feel comfortable to speak truthfully about what's really going on because you're supposed to put forward this nice picture of what a yoga teacher is. Well, if you listen to this show, you know that I'm very interested in debunking those kind of myths and having the kind of conversations that actually help us grow. And that's what we're doing every week in my teacher's class. And one of the more recent conversations we were having was about how if you teach a vinyasa class, you get a whole bunch of people who show up. But if you want to teach something more contemplative and not so fitness oriented, well, then it's a struggle to get 2 or 3 people there. And what do? Do you teach what people want, or do you teach what your heart wants to communicate? And having a place where you can be supported in that inquiry, where you've got fellow teachers who are going through the same stuff, it's just invaluable. It's my favorite thing to do each week. And if you're looking for that kind of support and community, then I think you might want to check it out. It's the J. Brown Yoga Weekly Teachers Class. You can find it at jbrownyoga.com. All right, here we are, you and me. This is J. Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is J. Brown. Thank you for choosing to listen. How are you? Yeah, I know. It's pretty fucked right now, isn't it? And forgive me for dropping an F-bomb all right here at the beginning. I'm sorry if your kid's in the car. But I have a feeling that my guest today, Michelle Johnson, won't mind. Given what I know about her, and you'll hear from our conversation, I think she's going to allow for me to have a little bit of outrage. And if you were listening last week, I was talking about some of my own personal tribulations, just my mundane shit that was going on and getting me down. And that's not what's getting me down this week. In fact, my week went much better. I'm doing personally just fine. Speaking of which, a number of you reached out to me after reading my blog post this month because you were concerned. Even some of my close friends, reached out and said, "Hey man, are you doing okay?" And I think that's because I wrote from a place of anxiety in myself, which I don't normally do. I don't normally allow for anxiety in my writing. I do in this podcast. I let my anxiety out in these intros all the time, as you know, but this month I just needed to let myself feel it. I needed to express this anxiety that I'm feeling. And last week it really was sort of an internal thing, like my own personal, as I said, shit. But this week it feels like the sky is falling or something. I mean, we're banning abortions? What the fuck? What the fuck is happening? Are we living in an authoritarian government? Sure seems like it. And I have these images from when I was a kid of Schoolhouse Rock and checks and balances in the government, and that doesn't really seem to be playing out so well right now. And, normally I don't bring politics into these talks so much, or at least not into these intros, because I'm not like a political science person. I don't have a lot of knowledge. I mean, I pay attention, but it's not like I would consider myself anyone who has anything that's worth hearing to say about politics necessarily. But I just feel like it would be almost ridiculous of me to try to just have my usual pleasantries today, given the state of things. So I just felt like I need to acknowledge that. And it is appropriate, given the conversation that I'm going to share with you today. I feel like I'm coming up against institutional injustice. And it breaks my heart. And some part of me wants to believe that humanity is benign and good, and that we would express care rather than hate. So it's very difficult to understand when I see the behaviors of so many others that they're just, I guess they're just trapped in fear, right? Oh man, see, this is why I never try to bring politics into this, because there's nowhere to go with it. It doesn't feel like there's anywhere to go with it. I feel like up against a wall. But it's perfectly appropriate that this is the way I'm introducing today's talk with Michelle Johnson, because that's what she's all about, is addressing this wall that I'm up against. And it's so intertwined, and it is about oppression in many regards. It's institutional oppression. And then people exploiting privilege, Instead of leveraging privilege to help people, it's like leveraging privilege to put people down more. Whatever group of people are being demonized. And as people who are yoga folks, people who listen to this show, I think the work that we do is utterly relevant, and it can't be separated out from it. And I'm not saying that it means we're all overtly political necessarily, but that it is utterly related. And we talk about that today, Michelle and I. We didn't know each other at all. You'll hear I lay some context for us, because this was, pretty much out of nowhere conversation, no preparation, no questions. You know me, I don't do that stuff. And this is a very honest and candid conversation that I think gets to some important matters. I'm very excited for you to hear it today. Now, before we do, let me say something about how yoga philosophy can affect a person's viewpoint and understanding in life, and how a study of the history and philosophies of yoga and the Sanskrit language can be a tool in that inquiry. If you're looking for some opportunities to have that kind of deeper study, I want to recommend that you check out today's sponsor, Yogic Studies. The founder of Yogic Studies, Seth Powell, has been on this show before. You can go back and listen to that episode. I was talking about it recently with Jim Mallinson, who was on. And I took Seth's course, The History and Philosophies of Yoga. You've heard me talk about it before if you listen to the show. I learned a lot from him. He's an excellent teacher. He has a gift for making things that are often kind of hard to grasp much more accessible. And I do think that that kind of study of the history and philosophies of yoga can be an invaluable doorway into the kind of contemplative understanding that I think is going to help us get out of the messes that we're in. So as a listener of the show, you can get a discount if you use promo code JBrown15, all capital letters. That's JBrown15, all capital letters. You'll get 15% off. Go to yogicstudies.com. Also, I would love to meet you in person, and I'm going to be out and about some, so let me tell you where I'm going to be. Australia, May 25th through June 2nd. Sydney is sold out, but there's still space in the Gold Coast and Melbourne. Australia, May 25th through June 2nd. I'm going to be in Rhinebeck, New York at the Omega Institute, June 16th through the 21st. And I'm going to be in Helena, Montana at the Feathered Pipe Ranch, August 17th through the 24th. You can find out about those gigs and more and all of the rest of my stuff at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, I think that's good. I really just want to get to it today. So I will touch base with you on the other side about this or that, who's coming on next week. But let's get into it. Let's listen to this conversation that I had with Michelle Johnson. Hi, Michelle.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Now you got some new headphones. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, it's actually much better. Yeah.
Cool. I think we're looking pretty good on my side too. As I said, we navigated traffic gods and internet gods to be here, but hopefully we've managed to find a secure connection to talk together today.
Yes, I hope so.
Well, I really appreciate it. You said you're in North Carolina. I was just sort of curious. It's earlier in the day. Have you had much happen with you yet in this day?
I went for a run because the weather's really nice right now. So that was good because I hadn't been running for a long time. So that was nice. And
where do you live? Do you live in a more rural kind of place or more of a suburban kind of place?
It's not really rural. I live in Winston-Salem, and I live in the northwest part of Winston, and so it's close to downtown, but not really urban, and it's not really out in the country. So it's sort of maybe in between those two things, whatever that's called.
I'm exactly in the same boat. I lived in Brooklyn for 20 years, and then 2 years ago, I moved about an hour and 45 minutes away to Pennsylvania. So it's close enough to a city, and there is a little downtown, but I can also take a 10-minute walk and be on a trail.
Yeah, that's nice.
So it's sort of in between, and I'm liking it. I'm liking that different pace of life.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't always live in North Carolina, though. Where did you live before you were in North Carolina?
Well, I actually lived in the Triangle, which in a town called Carborough, which is next to Chapel Hill, for about 20 years before moving to Portland, Oregon. And I lived in Portland last year. And then now I'm in the Triad, back in North Carolina, just a different part of North Carolina. But I grew up in Richmond, Virginia. So I was in Virginia for 20 years, went to grad school for social work in North Carolina, stayed for 20 years, went to Portland, and now I'm back.
Oh, okay. Well, I heard you speak a little bit about your childhood, and I did want to ask you something about that. But, before I just launch into stuff, I feel like we've never met before. You were gracious enough to accept my invitation. I have no idea whether or not you've ever listened to this show before. And I want to talk to you about difficult topics that are uncomfortable to talk about. So I think maybe some amount of context might be a good thing for us.
Yes, that would be helpful.
Good. I want you to know, because it was just we had one sentence emails to each other before this happened. So I wanted to say something to you maybe first about what prompted or motivated me to contact you and ask you to talk with me.
Okay, great.
I started this show, it's almost 4 years ago now. And, when I started it, I didn't really think too much about what I was getting into. I just thought it would be really fun, and I wanted to hear conversations that I wasn't hearing, and I wanted them to be real conversations, and I wanted yoga teachers to be off their scripts, and I wanted to be transparent and take down this kind of glossy picture of what a yoga teacher was. Mm-hmm. And, I had a yoga center for, 10 years in Brooklyn. I really rode the wave of yoga coming into the mainstream. I got into yoga before the internet, when it was still just coming out of the church basements and the living rooms. And I rode the wave and have made a whole career or life, basically, supported myself off of yoga teaching. Mm-hmm. And then the center kind of felt, I couldn't keep pace with the rising rents in Williamsburg. So after 10 years, I had to bail. And I sort of started this podcast before that happened, but in the process, kind of tracking how the hell did we get here? And so a lot of it's been about some oral history, trying to shine light on how we got here. But then all this other stuff came up. Like, I never really expected, like, as many people to be listening. Like, it's grown. And I feel a overriding feeling of responsibility now that I didn't expect.
Yeah.
You know, like, I want to be an ally for certain things as a person, and what I'm putting out in the world, like, I have to be accountable for that. So one of the things that doing a podcast does, especially this one, because I don't write out any questions or plan what I'm going to say before I start recording, it reveals all this stuff about me. And sometimes people who come on the show too. And a lot of people are into that. And I embraced it. And early on, it was very personal. It was like, oh, I don't listen very well and I interrupt people all the time. But then as I started to, and that part of that was also just like, there's this added pressure of recording. You know, I'm recording us right now. So some of it was like just wanting to have a good podcast. So there's some of that, but it was definitely also me not being a very good listener.
Yeah.
And then from there, frankly, we got into all kinds of conversations. I'm sure you're aware of all of the kind of institutional abuse in the yoga world and how a lot of it has been sort of spilling out, you know, on the tail end of the Me Too, renewed Me Too movement. So a lot of those conversations were coming up, and I came up against, you know, my privilege, my white male privilege and patriarchy, you know, where I've got people coming on and they studied with this guru who was also an abuser, and I buddy it up with them and I don't ask them hard questions, but I also want to be an ally of the victims. And then people call me out, and rightly so. So I came up against that, and I've been learning a lot. Karen Rain was one of the survivors of the Tabi Joyce abuse, and she came on, and it was a really important episode for me. After I recorded with her like this, she asked that we record again where she gets to ask me questions. And she kind of held me to account for episodes I've had in the past and why I didn't ask the questions that ought to have been asked. And it was very uncomfortable, and I got defensive, but I like caught myself getting defensive. And I said, wait a second, I don't want to do that. And I put it all out there for everybody to hear. And then there was a lot of interesting sort of blowback. A lot of people were upset with her. They felt like she was attacking me. And I was like, no, you don't understand. I invited her to do that. And she's not attacking me. And so anyways, this is a little bit of a long-winded way to get to it, that having grappled with that more recently, I can't remember her name. It's killing me that I didn't write it down. But I heard a woman speaking, and she basically said, they were talking about racism. And she said, you can't talk about racism without talking about patriarchy. And then more recently, I'm sure you saw this video of this student up in Columbia University or whatever getting profiled and harassed at the student union or whatever. And then, you know, I'm just like looking at the archive of this show, and it's the lack of representation of color is glaring. And, you know, a year and a half ago, someone criticized me on it, and I did like make an effort of sorts. I like made a list of all the teachers of color I knew. It was probably about 20. I reached out to maybe half or more, and I had like maybe 3 episodes, and those are the 3 episodes that I have. And I don't know. I felt like I feel like talking about race feels even harder to talk about than patriarchy for some reason. I'm not sure why. And then I brought this all up in a teacher's class. I do a weekly teacher's mentor meeting. And I'm happy to say that the makeup of that meeting is like more diverse than the archive of the show.
Good.
And I mentioned it, and someone brought up your book. They're like, oh, you got to read Michelle Johnson's book, Skill in Action. And so I picked it up. I've gotten through some of it, but I didn't get through all of it as I hoped prior to this moment. But all of this is just to say that I feel like I want to have a conversation about race today. I want to have a real conversation. I want you to feel comfortable to call me out if I misstepping. We've never met, so I just want to feel like we could have a real conversation. You wouldn't feel censored at all.
Yeah.
So from that, I guess I'm curious. I heard you mentioned you grew up in Richmond, Virginia. I have in-laws in North Garden, Virginia. It's not so far from there.
Yeah.
And I've heard you speak about that you had a biracial brother, and that you came up in a family that had like a lot of, I don't know how to say it, issues of race kind of baked in, but it wasn't necessarily talked about. And that you went to a school that was mostly white. And I'm wondering, having read some of your book, have you talked with your family since then?
Yeah. My mother, I gave her my book after it came out, and she read it, and I wasn't sure she was going to read it. I knew she was like proud of me, and I kind of thought she would read it, but I just wasn't sure. And she read it, and she shared the book with her Bible study, and I gave her like 20 copies, and she just handed them out to people. And part of that was being proud. Part of it was her reading my story and my perception of her in the story and our family. And she said she just got to experience a different perspective. And it was like she was getting to know me in a different way. And so given the content of the book, because it's focused on anti-racism and the intersection of justice and yoga, she read about racism and white supremacy. Of course, she knows about those things, but she read about it through my like lens and read my words that I use to describe how racism operates. And interestingly enough, after that, she started chair yoga. She's 76. She'd never been to an asana class before, and she started to be really motivated around going to chair yoga. And I found a class for her in Richmond, and she started to go. And so something happened through her process of reading the book, both with her understanding of yoga and also her. It's like she had a look into the work that I do in the world, because she knows me, but she had never experienced me in a dismantling racism training, or giving a talk about racism, or working with clients around racial identity issues. She'd never witnessed that. And so the book was a way she got to witness me and my childhood, and how my childhood and my experience in my family totally shaped why I'm the way I am now, and definitely influenced the work that I do in the world now. As you said, race was baked in because it is. I mean, everyone is a racialized being. White people and people of color are racialized beings, and mixed roots or biracial people are racialized beings. And so race to me is always at play, even though the culture says we're not racialized or only focused on people of color as a race and not white as a race or whiteness. And having a biracial brother who's adopted, who's 4 years older than me. My parents divorced when I was 2. My father was married to a white woman. So race was playing out in a very particular way in our family, yet we didn't talk about racism. We didn't talk about civil rights. My mother was a school teacher. And so I think she was like an organizer in her classroom, and she definitely believed in justice, and she just engaged in justice work in a different way than I do. And so I never had language in my family to describe what it was like to go to a school with all white kids, or be in a class with all white kids who had a lot of money. I didn't have language to describe institutional racism, and my mother wasn't talking to me about that. And I knew my brother's experience was different than mine because he's biracial and adopted, but we never talked about that either. I just knew he was biracial, and I knew he was adopted, but I didn't know anything beyond that. So there was some silence around race and how it was affecting us individually, and then as a family, and then our extended family as well, which I always thought was interesting. Why aren't we talking about what's happening around us? Which I'm sure led me just to be I'm going to write about what's happening, and I'm going to share it. And it's resonated with people from what I can tell. It's resonated with a lot of people. It's like a truth that has not always been centered, especially in the yoga world, around exclusion and inclusion and how to create equity and justice.
Well, the direct conversation about it does seem to me maybe a little bit generational, like something like a dismantling racism training. Like our parents, they don't know what that is, you know? And even like last week, you know, as I said, I wanted to do something about changing the makeup of this show's guest list. And last week I spoke with Jana Long, the head of the Black Yoga Teachers Alliance. And we went through the whole history of yoga in the Black community. We talked about Black theosophists and Noble Drew Ali. And, you know, we tracked a lot of stuff. And we did talk a little bit. I mean, we talked about racism some, but we didn't talk about it as like systematic, institutional in the way that you're writing about it. And I sort of brought it up, but she didn't go there. I mean, kind of, but she wanted to take a more positive, healing note, which I can appreciate also. You know, she didn't make criticisms or, you know what I mean? She came from a heart place, I think, which I really appreciated. But I did wonder if it's a generational thing. And I can see that even in, you know, the millennial generation and whatnot, they seem to be asking different questions than my parents asked, or even my generation asked.
Yeah, that makes me think about culture. And so, you know, growing up, white supremacy was not a term used in mainstream media. People of color was not a term that was used in mainstream media or in the educational system, right, as I went to school. Like, these are terms that I didn't hear. And so I think there's something about shifting culture and how that shapes the language we use, the experience we're having, like how we describe what it means to be a person of color, what it means to be white, what it means to be biracial. And so I do think it's generational, and there may be different reasons for that. I also think it's cultural. Like, I think the culture has shifted because when I turn on the TV, sometimes the news reporters talking about white supremacy, that is like a term I never heard before Trump actually was elected, as much as I hear it now.
Right, but doesn't it often, when you say white supremacy, like people think of Nazis? Actually, just today, there's a headline of a white supremacist who was put to death in Texas, if I'm not mistaken, for that very famous case where he dragged a person by the car. I'm forgetting names, but just today, that person was put to death in Texas. And the headline wrote, "White supremacist put to death for killing this person." But white supremacy, in the way I was reading in your book and the way I've heard you talk about it, isn't just Nazis.
Right.
It's about a system. And that's what I mean about a generational understanding of these things. It's about a system of, as you, I believe, put it, advantages, right?
Yeah.
So maybe you could say something about that, about when you say white supremacy, you're not just meaning Nazis, are you?
No, I mean, white supremacy is an ideology and belief system about white being superior. And there's a whole history of the race construct and how white was constructed, and how different groups of people of color, how we describe them, that was constructed as well. And so, and it changes over time based on the culture and what's happening. And so there's a hierarchy around race with white at the top, which supports whiteness as being seen as superior, and then black at the bottom, and other folks of color moving between those 2 points. And actually, I think, you know, I mentioned mainstream media using terminology that I didn't hear when I was a child. They're using it now, but they're also part of the culture, and they're part of institutional racism and cultural racism. And so one thing that whiteness does to perpetuate itself is to say white supremacy is just about the KKK, the Klan, or the man that you're referencing who was put to death for dragging the black man with the truck, dragging him on the ground to death. And I think whiteness says that's what white supremacy is, and that lets a lot of white people off the hook. So I think that's how it functions. And I think, while I think we've had cultural shifts, I'm not sure, like, media or other institutions that they're prepared to actually look at white supremacy as the air we're breathing in, the water we're drinking, like that it is all around us. And our work is to figure out how are we implicated in this system? Because I speak about myself, I can collude with white supremacy, right? So I'm not let off the hook either, even though I'm like a Black person moving in a racist culture.
You see, this goes to something important, because not so long ago, if I had heard you say what you were just saying about white being at the top, I think I would have had like a kind of reaction to that. And it's happened other times in this podcast where I've always thought of myself as a very thoughtful, progressive person. I remember in college, everyone used to call me a snag, a sensitive new age guy. And I've always felt like I wanted to be part of the solution in terms of justice in our world. And so when someone says that, I feel like, but I'm doing everything I can or whatever. I'm trying to be that kind of person in the world. However, as I mentioned recently, I wanted to get more people of color on the show. And I put together this big list, and I wrote to a bunch of people, and I'm recording these episodes. And I mentioned to my wife that I was doing this. And I'm not calling her out because I thought the same thing that she thought. And I told her, I said, I'm going to put out these episodes. And she said, oh, are you going to put them all out in a row? Would that be weird? So like, if I put out several episodes in a row with Black yoga teachers, that's a thing. Mm-hmm. But I've spent 4 years putting out episodes of white people in a row, and that's not a thing. Mm-hmm. And I'm saying that's what you mean when you say white supremacy, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And that you could, I mean, you've talked a little bit about your own process around just understanding whiteness, white supremacy, and the culture. And so I think the example you just gave is really powerful because it happens in so many settings where like having how many of our white folks you've had on your show goes unnoticed by many. I'm not going to say by everyone, right? Mm-mm. And then this real intention around, okay, I need to have Black folks on the show or people of color on the show. How am I going to go about that? And that you are right, that people will notice and wonder, white people and people of color, what is going on if you release how many of your episodes in a row with people of color or Black folks on your show. Mm-hmm. But the culture says like, that's a thing and what's going on. And whiteness says when it's a bunch of like white people, don't notice it. And that's what I meant when I said race was constructed and like whiteness says white is not a race. When white is a constructed race, it has real power. Not everyone became white at the same time. And so, but what whiteness does is say, don't look at that. And what whiteness also says, if you put a bunch of like Black folks on your show, that's unfair in some way. And resentment can build from that and defensiveness can come from that because that's tied to entitlement as well. In my mind, something that whiteness does is say, I'm entitled to this space. I'm entitled to speak. I'm entitled to have room. I'm entitled to, as you were talking about earlier about interrupting, I'm entitled to interrupt. I'm entitled to like share my opinion. That is what whiteness does, like the patriarchy does, like heterosexism does, like ableism does. So these behaviors are not specific to how white supremacy functions. They're specific to how oppression operates.
And that's the thing in terms of understanding how white supremacy and oppression are operating in our culture is, I think, what was eluding me and often eludes people in general, that it's hard for me to really get my mind around. But I think partly because I have traveled and I've left this culture some and seen other cultures and tried to experience them in a thoughtful way. But, as a white man, I have never experienced the kind of like social or institutional oppression that other people have. Mm-hmm. And so that it's not a mutual situation from the get-go, from the starting gate. And then I want to be a force for good in that injustice. But on a number of occasions, I have felt like, well, maybe I'm not even really one who should be talking. Like, other voices need to be heard, not another white dude who didn't have to face any oppression. So I don't know. I feel like that's that makes what I don't always know what to do with that. I guess what I'm saying, I don't always know what to do with that. I still want to feel good about expressing myself and creating and doing things. But I guess that the case is being made that in doing so, I'm taking up the space that other people would be occupying.
Yeah, I think that people have different opinions about this, what you're naming around like the role of white folks in creating justice or correcting the injustice connected to racism and white supremacy, or intervening and disrupting and interrupting white supremacy. So I'll just say my experience with dismantling racism work and training was that I was trained up by a collective of trainers, white people and people of color, which is not everyone's training. And when I say trained up, I mean like I attended a bunch of trainings and then started facilitating and then became a lead trainer. And I always had a white co-trainer with me. And I appreciated that because I can speak to whiteness because I have to understand it to survive and like navigate the culture. But whiteness has not been, and white people have not been conditioned to see me as an authority figure or a teacher or a trainer or wise. And so having a white co-trainer with me took some of the burden off of me to be educating white folks about whiteness and racism. And my white co-trainers, there's certain things they could say to the group that I know I could have said too, but they would have been received in a different way. And so that training of typically having like a white co-trainer in a lot of the work that I have done and am doing now, although I do some of my own, that informed the way I think about white people and their role in responding to white supremacy and racism. Because I absolutely think as a white male, you have a role to interrupting white supremacy and the patriarchy. And I also know that you will be criticized for engaging in it. And if you profit from it, then you're definitely going to be criticized by people. So people have very different perspectives about this. I'm offering my background about it because I think it's complex. And I think, and I've said this before to different people, I need white people to like work with white people and do some of this work because it's exhausting to do anti-racism work, although it's my calling and dharma. It's exhausting to do it and in a racist culture. Like I am walking around experiencing racism as I'm trying to invite people into undoing racism. And I'm inviting people into like enlightenment and awareness of how racism operates. That is exhausting. That takes a toll. There's an expense. And so I think there is a role for you.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. And I think you put your finger on something particularly important when you talked about, especially if I'm profiting off of this work, because I've certainly come up against that just in general in terms of being a yoga teacher and, you know, making a living off of what is a contemplative practice. There's this line that you have to ride in terms of when you're marketing what you do and how you're marketing what you do. And especially on this show, I just embraced like a level of transparency that's sometimes maybe to a fault even, just because I feel like if I don't have any secrets and I just put it all out there, then I'm learning. And it's definitely been something that's put me in some very uncomfortable situations, but I've leaned into that. And I know you've written about that in terms of there has to be a space for us to tell the truth, even if we put our foot in it.
Yeah. Yes.
So I'm wondering though, you talk about this training that you've had, dismantling racism training. And I'm curious about, you know, what sort of things does that involve? I know probably different people do it in different ways. And I was talking with someone who knows more about like the in-person teaching that you do. And they were saying that you kind of do it in maybe a little bit of a different way than some other folks. And the word they used was more embodied way. We're giving people experiences rather than just giving them like statistics or information. I was wondering if you might talk a little bit about what kind of training you're doing that you think helps people come to better understanding about this stuff in themselves.
Yeah. So when I sort of began the journey of being trained up that's what we would call it, being trained by my colleague, like mentors and collective of trainers, we would offer curriculum focused on personal, institutional, and cultural racism and shared language so that we had an understanding around when I say racism and you say racism, if we mean different things, it's going to be hard to organize or build a strategy to address racism. So we would focus on shared language and shared framework. And we would also talk about internalized racism and internalized white supremacy or internalized white privilege. So for about, I'd say 5 or so years at the beginning of this journey for me, we talked about it and we did move people through experiential activities, but there was a lot less embodiment than I bring into it now. And I think it's connected to my experience of practicing yoga. At some point after I started training, I started practicing more asana and meditation, and then I went through teacher training. And then I really thought about the link between, in a clear way, the link between justice and yoga and my anti-racism work and yoga and the principles of yoga. And so what that did is I would walk into dismantling racism spaces to train, and I would be like yearning for more breath and embodiment and movement and transformation that I think I experienced from asana and meditation and learning about the principles of yoga and just how to be in the world. And so I started to infuse more mindfulness into the trainings. And what that looks like is at the beginning of trainings, and it's any training I do now, we spend time meditating and centering and breathing because I want people to be present and in this space. And the other thing that I know happened for me, and it happened after Eric Garner was murdered, when he was saying, I can't breathe, I started to think about the breath in such a different way. And that's when I started to think about oppression taking the breath away, and this culture, like literally taking the breath away from folks of color or people who are marginalized. So the trainings began with the breath. Because I also say the breath is life-giving and it's generative in this culture that is constantly trying to take it away through this tool of oppression. And then throughout the training, when we're developing shared language and framework, there's some embodiment of the words, like embodiment of racism and white supremacy and advantage and oppression and system. And so typically I invite people to define the word, like do it from your intellect, and then move into your body or make a shape with your body that expresses the definition of this word. And that for people like, I mean, imagine embodying white supremacy, like being in the group that gets that word and they have to embody that some way, right? Yeah. That's a deep experience for people.
Well, I guess that's what I'm kind of getting to is how do we get, I mean, I teach very simple breathing and moving practices, and I feel that it has profound effect. I'm wondering, and to others, though, that's not always clear how we get there. How do we get from telling people to inviting people, let's say you said language, so let's use better language, inviting people to pay attention or engage their breath to a deeper understanding of institutional oppression? Like how do you think having yoga practices that encourage people to be more embodied or more in touch with their immediate experience, how do you think that translates into people having more understanding about the things that we've been talking about?
Yeah, I think the invitation to move and breathe, and especially to do that in community, and then to do it in a community that's diverse or mixed, so you're like in a space with very different people. I think the possibility to connect like to the truth through the movement is what I've seen happen. And so I believe that on a cellular level, you understand white supremacy and you understand whiteness and you understand harm. And I imagine you recognize like when repair needs to happen and when it doesn't and what the impact of that is. And I, on a cellular level, understand harm and the heart and oppression and heartbreak related to oppression and the trauma and ancestral trauma. Given my privileged identities, I understand like entitlement, when I feel like I'm deserving of something. Of course, race complicates that, and it's the most salient identity I embody. Like for me, it is. So I think there's this invitation to move and breathe and reconnect to the truth, like what we know on a cellular level, but what we've been conditioned to not remember. Like culture has said, don't talk about this, don't remember it, deny it, like don't have the conversation we're having right now. And the breath, because it's life-giving and generative, invites us back into like our humanity, the truth of who we are, the possibility of like being different and being connected in the way that yoga speaks about, and recognizing the ways in which we're not able to be connected because of systems. So I think it happens. I think it can happen, but it takes practice. That's what I think.
Well, I do too, and I'm fishing a little bit because this is where you and I think, sing some of the same song in terms of what we do in practice, and specifically breath as a role in practice. Because I read stuff that you've written about, breath connecting us to our body, and that connecting us to our heart, and that connecting us to our values and our humanity, and then our shared humanity. And I feel like that's been like the process in me of coming to be more intimate with myself, primarily through an attention on breath, originally led to a sense of myself and humanity, which automatically started translating out to being aware of the suffering of others around me. Mm-hmm. And I think it's like actually the blurb on the back of your book, or something like that, that I'm basically kind of quoting or, paraphrasing here. And I guess I'm wondering, for you personally, I'm assuming that that's where that comes from, that you had a similar process of yoga helping you process what you're up against.
Yeah, I also think, because I think yoga is like everything, that my first dismantling racism training was a practice of yoga and of staying with the discomfort and of truth telling. And I had an experience of being given language to describe what I had been experiencing for, at that point, 21 years. But no one had told me this is institutional racism. But I was walking around with the feeling of like trauma from institutional and cultural racism. So I think it's tied to that experience of like, oh, there's liberation from having words to describe my experience and the experience other people of color are having. And it's not just me, like it's not just in my head, right? That racism is real. It's happening on a cultural level, not just personal level or interpersonal. And then I think yoga mirrors that in some ways, or has my experience of it, because I could experience the breath in a way that I never had before. And part of my birth story is not being able to breathe when I came into the world. And so the breath and my capacity to breathe feels like a privilege, but also like something that's my birthright and something I didn't have when I came into the world. And then something I've like grown up and witnessed people, like I mentioned, Eric Garner, so many people whose breath has been taken away at the hands of systems that have been conditioned to like make people feel less than, or to annihilate people, to harm people. And so, yes, I think it's the dismantling racism training, and I think it's the breath and the practices that I experienced in yoga and the invitation.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of Jay Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.